Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Professor Roberto Borghi from the Institute of Economics at Unicamp, University of Campinas. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. Today, in this webinar, we'll have the book launch of entitled A Chinese Bureaucracy for Innovation-Driven Development, written by Professors Alexandre de Freitas Barbosa from Anglia Ruskin University in the United Kingdom, and also from the University of Campinas, research at the University of Campinas, and Tobias and Brink from the Constructor University Bremen in Germany. Thank you very much, Alexandre and Tobias, for sharing today some of discussions about your new book, just published by the Cambridge University Press this year. So it's a very important and insightful book with great contributions to the topic of development and Chinese development, especially the bureaucracy in Chinese government and how that have helped promoting innovation development, specifically discussing two key strategic sectors nowadays, the semiconductors and electric vehicles. So it's a great pleasure to have you all here. So for those who are following us at YouTube, we will start with the presentation of Professor Alexandre and then Tobias, and later we'll have the comments of Professor Antonio Carlos Diegues from also the Institute of Economics at Unicamp, and finally we'll pick some questions and answers at the end of our webinar. So if you have any questions, you can put in the chat at YouTube. So it's a great pleasure on behalf of the Institute of Economics at Unicamp and the Group of Studies of China and Brazil, also at Unicamp. It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much, Alexandre and Tobias again. Alexandre, then the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you of course, for organizing the event. It's a pleasure to be back here again. And so let me see if I can share the slides. Okay, it's here, right? Can you all see it? Yeah, possibly so, right? Okay. Okay, so thank you, Roberto, for introducing us. And so today, I will introduce our recently published book entitled A Chinese Bureaucracy for Innovation-Driven Development. And this is the outcome of years of research made primarily in Bremen, in Germany, under the sponsorship of the DFG, so it's the German Research Foundation, who provided the financial support for the project. And well, I started this research in late 2019, and Tobias had already been working on similar topics such as innovation, innovation platforms, innovation intermediaries, even before that, including field work to China before the pandemic. So this is the result of our joint efforts to understand this puzzle of the Chinese bureaucracy and innovation. So let me start first highlighting some of the key issues and debates that we cover in the book. And first of all, it's important to highlight that we are talking to different people, to a very diverse audience. So for those who have read the book, I think probably this is quite clear. So we're dialoguing with economists from different backgrounds, but also political scientists, Chinese scholars, innovation scholars, development studies specialists. So we have a quite broad audience, and that's part of our intention as well. So some of the key topics and debates we're covering here involve, for instance, the central bureaucracy. So you ask whether or not the Chinese central bureaucracy has a capacity to formulate long-term strategies and, in some cases, to change the course of direction, if it's the case. So really what you're talking about is the possibility to change patterns of capital accumulation in China, or if you wish to frame it a different way from the innovation perspective, the directionality, so direction of innovation in China. And in order to do so, you also tackle the different backgrounds of bureaucrats in some key ministries. And this is a topic that sometimes is neglected by some scholars. But here we really try to understand the background that different bureaucracies have and which type of bureaucrats staff different bureaucracies. But beyond the central bureaucracy, beyond understanding the key ministries, we also try to have a look on the problems of policy implementation. And here the role of the local states are very important. So we try to understand how local states may implement or may not implement certain policies decided by the central level or the national level. And here you argue that the central level has a kind of longer term orientation, but local states in comparison have a shorter term orientation. And we also cover other two related but different issues. That is, one, state-business relations, and the second, state-market relations. So when it comes to state-business relations, we are really trying to understand the patterns of interaction between state agents or state bureaucrats with business people. So are they isolated from each other? Probably not. But if they're not, what is the nature of the interactions? So that's a big question we try to also address. And finally, state-market relations. So here we try to have a look on whether the state and the market are complementary or competing means or mechanisms of resource allocation and also resource creation. So we hope we can give some insights on those topics with our contribution. So this is the basic table of contents of the book. So we have pretty much 5 different parts. The first part is the introduction, where we introduce the developmental state debate, and that's basically is our analytical framework. So that's in the introduction, we provide our analytical framework, which you employ in the remainder of the book. Then you create a sort of periodization in the Chinese reform era. So the first 20 years, roughly speaking, we call growth by any means. So that's when China was really trying to do everything to boost GDP growth. That's a relatively short part of our book. The most important part is the third part, that is the innovation-driven strategy, which starts by the late 90s, but takes full shape by the early 2000s and so on. So that's perhaps the most important part of the book. So it's chapter 2.2. And then after analyzing this period of the innovation-driven strategy from the early 2000s to the present, we assess 2 different industries. So first, electric vehicles. So it's a typical new emerging industry, but also you compare it with the development of the semiconductors industry, which is, on the other hand, sort of a mature catch-up industry. And we argue that China is better posed to face the challenge of promoting new emerging industries. And I hope we can explain why in our presentation. And finally, conclude and set some future research avenues. So now let me start presenting our analytical framework, which is formed on insights from the developmental state debate. And here it's important to highlight that we're not trying to answer whether China is or is not a developmental state. So it's not a developmental state as a typology, yes or no, but rather we use some well-established concepts in order to create a coherent analytical framework. So we can look at China, analyze what's going on nowadays. So what are those concepts? The first one is bureaucratic coherence, which we divide into 2 different dimensions. The horizontal dimension, which is the national level or the central level, if you wish. And the second dimension is the vertical dimension. So if you wish, the local states and how the central government gets together with different local states. So the central-local relations literature. In relation to the first dimension, the horizontal dimension, we're asking whether China has managed to forge a sort of uncontested national pilot agency, similar to those in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. But you're also looking at if China has managed to create a sort of professional technocracy. And here, by technocracy, we mean bureaucrats recruited mostly on technical competence other than patron-client relations or patrimonialism. And at the vertical dimension, we're trying to ask whether local bureaucrats, they can work in tandem with the central objective. So are they responsive to the central directives, and to which extent? And if they deviate from the central level, why is that the case? And in particular, you look at the systems of fiscal decentralization and, of course, the CADE evaluation system. The second key concept from the developmental state that is part of our framework is the idea of state-business coalitions, and as a result, discipline over business. So here we ask whether the bureaucracy has forged coalitions with business and, of course, the science system. So whether there is this common interest between business, state bureaucrats, and the science system. Now, given that we may find close ties between state and business, we must ask ourselves whether the bureaucracy is able to discipline business in order to steer them towards technological upgrading and innovation. So the goals of this last 20 years. And in order to ask this question, we first have to know how the state monitors business. So which monitoring criteria is the Chinese state using? Here's important to remind that for Alexandre, who came up with this concept of discipline in the developmental state literature, she was using exports as a proxy or as a variable in which states bureaucrats arguably would monitor business. And the importance of exports in South Korea was, of course, because they were at the same time very easy to measure and also very hard to manipulate. That's why Amazon defends the use of exports as a sort of monitoring criteria. And it's always important to remember that despite the more technical debate or which variable you're using for monitoring, discipline is always dependent on the state power over business. So whether the state controls political power. And this is, of course, a function of historical legacies that cannot be replicated easily in different cases of economic development. Now, we can move to what we call the growth by any means era, which supposedly took place between the 80s and 90s, and that takes a relatively short period of time, or length in our book. Just to try to summarize some key legacies to the second period of our analysis. When it comes to the bureaucratic coherence at the horizontal level, we found no uncontested pilot agency. So here, China was very, very different from the canonical developmental state. Moreover, the S&T system, so science and technology system, was quite fragmented and very disconnected from business. And that's create problems in terms of promoting R&D investments. At the vertical dimension, so central-local relations, we found an important problem in the fiscal dimension, that is the local fiscal mismatch between revenues and expenditures at the local level. So because local bureaucrats or local governments, they typically had less revenues than expenditures, they had to create new sources of budgetary revenues. And that has made local bureaucrats incentivized to search for any type of quick and secure source of fiscal revenue. And that meant that their time horizons was quite short in relation to the central level, leading them to boost whatever activity will generate quick GDP growth and promise quick fiscal returns. And as you're going to see, that will be a problem for the second period of our analysis. And when it comes to coalitions and discipline, we observed the emergence of state business coalitions underpinning rapid GDP growth. So there was an emergence of private business and business in general, and they got together with state bureaucrats in many different ways, as discussed in the book, and this was important to generate GDP growth. However, most of those firms were not really investing in R&D capabilities and R&D investments, which of course is a problem for the second period of time based on innovation-driven strategy. And he also found a lack of stable institutional mechanisms in order to put business and bureaucrats together. So these coalitions were very, very much informal and decentralized. And given those legacies, and especially the problems of this growth by any means period, which was very positive in terms of generating quick GDP growth, but a bit more problematic in terms of delivering innovation, the Chinese government started to promote a different type of strategy, which many call the innovation-driven strategy or innovation-driven development. And here, I'm sure many of you are familiarized with many of those very large innovation programs So we can talk about the strategic emerging industries, for instance, the Made in China 2025, which is very famous, the Chinese standards, and there are many different types of programs here, which all cater to the same idea or the same goal, which is to promote innovation in China, in particular indigenous innovation. And complementing those very large innovation-driven programs, we also observed a number of sector-specific industrial policies. So very specific programs in order to develop certain industries. And as you're going to discuss later, both semiconductors and electric vehicles are two very fine examples of these sector-specific industrial policies that are part of this broader program of innovation-driven or indigenous innovation strategy. Well, the combination of these very large programs and the sector-specific industrial policy programs generate good results, as you can see here from this figure. So if you start with the figure on R&D expenditure, which is the blue bar here, there was a dramatic increase in R&D expenditure from the 2001 until 2020. Similarly, the R&D intensity, that is R&D expenditures as a share of GDP, has also increased quite a lot, from roughly 1% of GDP 20 years ago to closer to 2.5% in 2020. So this was a dramatic success in China in terms of improving its R&D capabilities and R&D investments, which makes us believe innovation has also benefited from that. However, there are some problems along the way started to emerge. Here we highlight the problem of lack of investments in basic research, which is the orange bar, if you can see in the figure, and actually so small that sometimes you can't even see in comparison to total R&D expenditures. And if you have a problem in terms of basic research, that most likely over the longer run will undermine your innovation efforts. And we're going to discuss that soon. You have a similar story when it comes to patents. So if you pay attention on the blue line here, which is total patent applications, again, we observe a very strong rise in total patent applications from roughly 200,000 units in 2001 to over 5 million in 2020. So again, the same story. Just like R&D expenditures, there was a dramatic rise in patent applications. So again, pointing out very positive outcomes in terms of innovation. However, there are some problems along the way, right? So similarly, if you have a look on the data specifically for invention patents instead of total patent applications, and if you pay attention in particular on innovations patent granted instead of only applications, we see that the figure is way lower. So if you take, for instance, the green line, innovation patent granted, that corresponds to roughly 10% of the total of patent applications. So just like in the previous figure, you can see that, yes, on the first look, we have a quite important improvement and a dramatic positive result. On the other hand, we can also start to realize some problems along the way. And with our framework, hope you can make sense and understand both this positive aspect, but also the problems created along the way. So starting in the 2000s, now we are moving to the second period of analysis, the innovation-driven strategy from 2000s to 2020s. We observed a strengthening of bureaucratic coherence, especially at the horizontal level. So just to give a couple of very remarkable examples, we observed the rise in importance of the MOST. MOST is the Ministry of Science and Technology. Of course, the creation of NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission, in 2003. And finally, another ministry that's quite important, but sometimes overlooked by the literature, the MIIT, so the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, which was created in 2008 and has a more technocratic background in terms of its bureaucrats. So it's quite different from NDRC, for example. That's a comparison we make in the book. And on the top of that, we analyze some reforms in order to improve the national coordination efforts of the whole science and technology system, and also to improve the allocation of R&D programs. And the most in particular, the Ministry of Science and Technology became even more important in the past 5 to 7 years. Now, things start to get more interesting when you bring into the picture the role of local governments, or in our framework, what we call bureaucratic coherence at the vertical level. So when you bring in central-local relations, there are a lot of positive developments in this period in terms of trying to increase bureaucratic coherence at the vertical dimension. For example, local officials now are evaluated according to a broader set of targets, and especially those related to innovation. So patents, as we discussed before, became official target on which bureaucrats are evaluated. So no wonder we saw a dramatic rise in patents, well, precisely because, among other reasons, they are evaluated based on patents. But also other variables are also important. For instance, high-tech output became important in this period. So these are attempts to drive local officials to behave in accordance with innovation-driven goals. A second set of reforms try to streamline this multi-layered vertical bureaucratic structure of China. In particular, try with the aim of improve the control that the center has over lower level units. So the idea here is to make the central level closer to lower level units in order to increase the compliance of lower level governments. However, we should remember the problem of the local fiscal mismatch that we discussed in the growth by any means era. So that's a legacy from the growth by any means era, which was not entirely addressed even up to now. And that means that local bureaucrats are still incentivized to search for quick and secure sources of fiscal revenues. And again, that means you try to boost GDP growth, which could be, of course, very positive in the short run, but that creates a certain set of ambiguous incentives for local officials, and still a shorter term horizon in comparison with the central government. So just to give a couple of examples, local officials are still quite incentivized to attract FDI, and that could be positive in terms of short-run economic growth, but that could crowd out indigenous innovation in certain contexts. Similarly, we find the problem for investments in R&D. So there's a strong incentive to invest in applied research because, of course, this tends to be easily commercialized and therefore generate fiscal returns. On the other hand, that tends to crowd out basic research. And then you start to understand why basic research has not improved that much in these last 20 years. And similar goes for patents. So as you mentioned, now local officials are evaluated according to different variables and targets, one of them patents. But then that means that local officials start to support any type of patent, regardless of their, let's say, the true value of innovation. And then again, we start to explain why we saw skyrocketing levels of patent applications, but relatively lower levels of invention patents granted. Our second variable here in our framework, as remember, is the idea of coalitions and discipline. And here, building on the developments of the growth by any means era, we observe the process of institutionalization of consultative bodies in order to better promote information exchange between bureaucrats on the one hand and businesses on the other hand. And of course, in the most recent years, they started to include the science system. So the science systems or research institutes and universities to also communicate better with the industry. And here, the rise of local innovation intermediaries, or the so-called new R&D institutes, are quite important, in particular to promote technological transfer and overcome the so famous problem of the valley of death. In terms of discipline, different types of mechanisms were tried in this period, and we highlight here the selective use of tax breaks and allocation of subsidies as forms of discipline mechanisms. And soon we're going to discuss the case of electric vehicles, and I'll give you some very concrete illustrations of that. But the general idea is that these new science technology policies and R&D subsidies are here to guide investments toward the goals set by the central government, in particular towards innovations-driven goals and innovative sectors, in particular high-tech manufacturing. So again, this idea of directionality. So they say it's not about how much to innovate, but which direction you're trying to innovate. So in general, we're trying to guide the sectoral profile of investments in the economy. So as discussed previously, attempts to change the pattern of capital accumulation in the country. I can move quickly to the comparison between electric vehicles on the one hand and semiconductors on the other, and hopefully we can illustrate some of the general points I have just made. In both cases, we analyze and observe increased horizontal bureaucratic coherence. And that meant in practice that both sectors enjoyed continuous policy support and very clear long-term objectives, which of course is quite helpful in order to promote both industries. So it's not a surprise that during this period, we observed the rise of domestic firms. For instance, BYD and CATL in terms of electric vehicles. So CATL promotes electric batteries in particular. And for semiconductors, SMIC, which is manufacturing, and HiSilicon, which is, of course, a subsidiary of Huawei in terms of semiconductors design in particular. So furthermore, what we argue here is that the idea of vertical coherence can help to explain the ambiguity of local governments. They can be extremely helpful and powerful in the promotion of the industry. So they are very active in promoting the new industry, supporting the industry in whichever possible way. And there's also a lot of experimentation, as you try to argue in the book. So this is quite positive. On the other hand, because every single local government is trying to do pretty much similar things, there's a dispersion of investments. And if this dispersion of investments, we have the undermining of economies of scale, which could be a problem for the development of certain industries. And the general argument here is that when you're talking about new emerging industries, where you still don't have incumbent leaders and you don't have a clear blueprint, that's precisely the case of electric vehicles. The benefits of this the vertical incoherence actually are very functional, and they outweigh the problems in relation to vertical incoherence. On the other hand, when you go to other types of industry, in particular kind of mature and catch-up industries such as semiconductors, which we compare with electric vehicles, the dispersion of investments is such a highly capital-intensive industry, it can be actually more problematic and undermine catching up efforts. So here we argue that China is actually better posed to succeed in new emerging industries rather than in older or mature catching up industries. That's primarily down to the role of local governments in this particular aspect. So just like in the general case that we observed stronger coalitions and the institutionalization of coalitions between business and state bureaucrats, we find similar trends in both sectors, both electric vehicles and semiconductors. Now, I believe the debate starts to get more interesting when we talk about discipline here, because as you're going to show, exports in China are not high enough, in particular in those sectors, in order to be used convincingly as a measure for discipline. So that means that the Chinese bureaucracy has to come up with different methods and different variables in order to discipline businesses. And as you're going to show, there's a lot of regulations aiming at pegging technological upgrading to the performance or sophistication of companies. So the idea is the more sophisticated you get or you are, you can receive more subsidies or fiscal support. If you cannot be so sophisticated, if you fail in promoting technological upgrading, you're punished by not getting so much subsidies. So just to give you one example here for electric vehicles industries, if you take the first table on your left-hand side, China managed to export solely 1% of its total production. And if you compare with other countries such as Japan and South Korea, this number really pales in comparison. I'm talking about 66% in Japan and 74% in South Korea, while China managed to export only 1% of its total production. So this data ends in 2019, but we have been gathering more recent data. And if you take the data for 2022 and 2023 up to now, so until October, so that's the last data I got, exports of electric vehicles in China actually increased quite a lot. So it has gone up to 10% in 2022 and 14% in 2023. So while there was a quite dramatic rise in exports, as a proportion of the domestic production, that's still a quite low figure. So if you compare again to the figures of Japan and South Korea, this is quite low. So the general argument that is exports cannot be reliable as source of discipline still holds. And this is particularly true if we exclude the data for Tesla. That is because Tesla is the top exporter in China. And Tesla, of course, is not a Chinese domestic company, so we're not really concerned with whether Tesla is upgrading or not. So when you exclude the data for Tesla, actually China managed to export only 6% of its total production in 2022 and around 9.5% of its total production this year up to now, up to October. And we find similar results for semiconductors. So if you compare the performance of SMIC, China's leading manufacturing company, that's the blue line, with TSMC, which is the global leading company from Taiwan, we can see that TSMC, not surprising, exports mostly of its production. When we talk about Taiwan, the small island. And SMIC doesn't export that much. And what's even more important, it has been decreasing over time. So actually exports actually is decreasing in the past few years. Exports a share of the total production. The same goes with other domestic companies such as Huahong. So the data for semiconductors in the sense confirms what's happening with electric vehicles. So if China doesn't have exports as a mechanism of discipline, they start to use different types of discipline mechanisms. And as you mentioned before, there's an attempt to peg technological upgrading performance to fiscal benefits. So this is a typical case in the case of electric vehicles, where the general idea here is the more sophisticated you are, you can keep receiving subsidies. If you are not sophisticated enough, we cut your subsidies over time. And that's what happened with companies producing electric vehicles with a driving range shorter than 200 kilometers, for instance, after 2008. So the general idea for this table is if you manage to upgrade and promote technological upgrading and innovation, you can keep receiving subsidies. While if you fail to do so or keep producing less sophisticated ones, we don't give you subsidies. So that's a softer form of discipline. So just to conclude some key takeaways before I exceed my time, what we found in a nutshell was first, increased horizontal coherence and greater capacity to steer innovation. And in particular, we highlight the rise of some key central ministries, the Ministry of Science and Technology, the MIT in particular, that we believe we should discuss more in the literature, and the NDRC. However, even with this increased horizontal coherence, China is still far short of the ideal type of centralized pilot agency. So China cannot be said to be a typical developmental state in the sense it's a different animal. We also highlight the long-term orientation of the central bureaucracy, which is has a problem when it comes to policy implementation, because local agencies have typically shorter-term horizons, and that creates problems in terms of implementation of policies, and also problems in terms of disciplining local agencies. When it comes to coalitions, we observe the emergence and institutionalization of certain consultative mechanisms between state bureaucrats, business, and science and technology organizations. So trying to put the science system together with businesses and the state. But again, we still have problems in investments in very important areas, in particular, the more uncertain areas, such as basic R&D. That's because of the shorter horizon orientation of local agents. In terms of discipline, again, it's very different from the canonical developmental state, especially because they use exports and they don't have the option to use exports. So it's not on par on the level found in canonical developmental states. And a final point that we discuss in passing in the book, but I think it's quite important, a point missed in much of the literature, is that much of those programs, those innovation programs and sector-specific industrial policies, they are driven, among other factors, of course, by fears of premature deindustrialization in the country. So what we see actually is we see very strong attempts to direct investments toward high-tech manufacturing and R&D intensive sectors. So, for example, the very famous crackdown business that took place in 2021 mostly, we argue that it was not an indiscriminate assault on business in general, because manufacturing in reality was largely spared. So most of those businesses that suffered from the crackdown 2 years ago were actually in the services sector. So we're talking about some policies that are trying to privilege industry over services. And this one concrete illustration is the so-called Little Giants programs, which we're talking about basically private high-tech businesses that are strongly supported by the state. And the final point, when we talk about state and markets as means or alternative means of allocation for resources, we found that they're not antagonistic in general, but they can actually be combined creatively in order to create more resources. So the state can spur the creation of whole new markets, which eventually you bring in new profitable opportunities for business. With that in mind, I finished the presentation, and I thank you, Roberto, and everyone who's organizing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. It was very insightful presentation. As well, when we read the book, we find some of these key ideas, and it's very important that you also shared and very briefly a bit on the book's ideas. So you cover most of the ideas, and it's very insightful. I think that brings us to our second part. I think Tobias, if Tobias wants to highlight and point as well of the book, it's very important contribution you both bring to the literature, to the understanding of the Chinese development, and this new approach on innovation, and how the Chinese bureaucracy differs from previous or other developmental states in the past. So we're very glad to hear all your comments as well. Tobias, please.
I think I keep it very short, because I think Alex has done a great job in giving the key ideas of the book, and I'm actually also very excited to hear our comments from the discussant. So I think I leave it to one point, and that is, like it or not, what we find is that the Chinese bureaucracy in some fields, in the fields that we cover, is relatively successful in fostering innovation capacities of firms. I think this is really the key for me. When it comes to comparisons to any other emerging economy, China stands out. And I think this brings up this idea of industrial policy back to the fore. As you all know, this is also coming back even in Western states, and some economists are really starting to take it very seriously. Again, if you think of Mazzucato or Dani Rodrik and several others. And actually the Chinese experience with these policies, I think, are really worth studying. The successes as well as the failures. I mean, Alex was mentioning some of them. And I think this is really key, to make the Chinese case a case that is comparable with other emerging economies, plus, of course, more advanced economies, and to hereby create a dialogue of how, innovation-driven development, to take this Chinese term, or what the Chinese like to call Chuangqin Qudong Fajian, is really something that needs to be then discussed in a hopefully sober and neutral and nice way. I stop here. I think Alex has done a very good job, and I'd like to hear the discussant.
So now maybe we can give the floor to Professor Diegues, right? So Diegues will comment on the book. Sorry for the technical issues. We're just discussing innovation and technological upgrades. Professor Diegues, please.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so let's move on. First of all, I would like to congratulate Professor Tobias Brink and Professor Alexandre for the great book. It's such an amazing book. I have already told them before. I will start my discussion with trying to highlight uh, three main contributions of the book to the debate. So I would like you to explore a little bit more after my comments, and I will put some questions in order to try to complexify some of these contributions. The first contribution, in my point of view, is that you have made a very good job, a really very good job in trying to understand Chinese developmental state strategy as a unique one. So this is the first point. You don't try to understand China as another example of emulating some successful strategies of other countries in Asia. So you put a lots of light on China's specificities. So this is the first contribution to the literature. The second one, maybe you could bring some comments about that. It's not explicit on the book, but one can verify the strong idea. This is a very, very strong idea with very important implications for formulating industrial and development policies in the global south countries. The idea is that, on the contrary of other historical examples of developmental state strategies, when we look to Chinese bureaucracy, as you highlighted on the book, we can verify that the Chinese bureaucracy wasn't and still isn't read or built to manage the strategy of development as we should understand if we just use a Weberian type of bureaucracy. I'm trying to mean is that when we look to Japan case or Korea case, the literature, uh, Professor Haijun Shang, Alice Amsden, Robert Wade, Chalmers Johnson, Peter Evans, they seem to analyze this country's strategies, taking into account the idea that the bureaucracy was built. So they had a bureaucracy that could manage the strategy. So this is the starting point. When you look to China and other papers or other books, when look to China, seems to admit the same hypothesis. And you don't make that in your book. You gave us a great contributions in looking to China's strategy uh, and looking to the bureaucracy and analyzing it and its fragilities and the movement of learning inside the bureaucracy. So at the same time, your book looked to the transformations in China's strategy of development. You look to transformations in bureaucracy. It's a movement where the bureaucracy uh, try to learn step by step, or what Heiner Kattel in his last book, How to Build an Entrepreneurial State Based on Bureaucracy, pointed out. It's also important to the bureaucracy to create dynamic capabilities in order to learn and to modify itself. So this is your second very important contribution in my point of view. The third contribution of the book is related to the field work, what is very difficult to do nowadays, including or mainly in China. You pointed out lots of contradictions in Chinese bureaucracy, coalitions, and the difficulty to create horizontal and vertical coherence. Horizontal and vertical coherence. So this is a very important point too you bring to the debate. And Alexandre pointed some of the reasons to explain this movement. But what I would like to highlight and what I would like to hear more about you, it's the idea that's not, again, that's not wrote in the book with this word, but you create all the paths toward this idea that when looking to Chinese bureaucracy, including Chinese bureaucracy, what is, if we look to all of the major countries of the world, we are always jealous, at least in Global South, about Chinese instruments, tools, and ability to steer the development. But including when looking to China, there are huge problems related to locking. So in this bureaucracy in China, at the same time they evolve, they transform themselves, they learn different forms, arrangements, and way of behaving in different strategies. They still are, or some part of them, as Alexandre told us about Suzhou, they are locked in to the previous paradigm. So there are difficulties in order, including in China, to overcome one paradigm, growth by any means, toward a new paradigm, innovation-driven nation. So these tensions and this difficult to overcome this institutional locking is very important. So in my point of view, this is your third contribution. And to conclude the part of contributions, after that I have two brief questions. I will try to be brief. You have, I wasn't confident about saying that is a contribution or a hypothesis. I think that's a very strong hypothesis that could be used for other future papers or books. Uh, this hypothesis has a very, very, very strong idea. In my point of view, this is the most important point of the book, at least the way I read it, is the idea that when you try to analyze Chinese strategy of development and how the bureaucracy fits to the challenges, you pointed in one or two paragraphs the idea that it depends, the success of these strategies depends on the level of development of the sectors and how the sectors are competing. What I mean is that you told us that in emerging industries where one can verify some puzzle in the markets, there are lots of agents. We cannot verify some very strong barriers to enter, and we have technological capabilities not ready yet. The Chinese model of bureaucracy, fragmented, based on experimentalism and other things, is more suitable to this kind of challenges. So you try to create a link between the level of development of the sector or the stage of development of a sector or technology and how suitable is Chinese bureaucracy to this level. On the contrary, you said when looking to semiconductor sectors, oh, semiconductor sector, this sector has very high barriers, it's very stable. Um, So in order to catch up, to be in the frontier, including in China, this old style of bureaucracy, it's not enough. So we need to create a stronger bureaucracy with more coherence, more centralized, in order to avoid what Hajun Shan says, social waste related to excess of competition. So you try to create this link between the levels of development of a sector and the levels, the abilities needed by the bureaucracy. So I think that's a very strong hypothesis, and I would like to hear you more, if you agree with the idea of Professor Kun Lee, who tries to analyze catching up strategies of Asian countries, and Latin American countries, linking it to the level of maturity of the technologies. What he says is that if you have long-term technologies, they are more stable and the barriers are higher. It's difficult to create a catching up there. And if you have short time cycle technologies, it's easier and you need other type of bureaucracy. So what I would suggest is the idea that this these different stages coexist in China. So at the same time, you have stable sectors when Chinese economy is still catching up, but they are not reaching the frontier. That fragmented bureaucracy was enough or made a good job because they were agile, and then they could respond to the signals. But on the contrary, when we are in sectors that are stable and Chinese is reaching the frontier, like semiconductors are trying to reach the frontier, we need more centralization. And we could put a third level of analysis in this kind of relation between bureaucracy and technology regimes, and that when we are at the frontier with unstable structures, maybe Chinese could teach the world how to create different instruments. So I'd like to hear your idea about this. The question is, on Chinese economy is trying to, on the contrary of Japan, Taiwan, and Korea, at the same time conclude its catching up strategy. On the same time, conclude it and to push technological frontier, they have to deal with different challenges, and they don't have a blueprint, as Alexandre said, or they don't have the past. They don't know the past because no other country did this movement before, of at the same time fighting for leadership in new emerging technologies and at the same time trying to still conclude it catching up. So Chinese bureaucracy has to be at the same time in both levels dealing with different challenges. And what are the challenges to keep these different movement running toward the same direction, that is fostering productivity, but with different instruments? What do you think about this idea of the Chinese trying to reshape its bureaucracy in order to deal with this challenge, without having a blueprint or a path to do that? So the last question, very briefly, is the idea to coordinate the bureaucracy. The book pointed that in some cases there are fragilities and lack of coherence, but at the same time, the movement toward an innovation-driven nation needs a bureaucracy that is different from the one needed to support China as the manufacturer of the world, and or the workshop of the world, or the factory of the world. And at least in my point of view, China wants to become or to hold both positions as the manufacturer of the world and as an innovative nation. So they will need different bureaucracy, industrial policy instruments in different regions of the country to support these two movements at the same time. So how could then deal with this challenge and create an effective and functional coordination of the bureaucracy? So this is my second question. I apologize myself for taking so long time, and I congratulate you again about the brilliant book. I took so long time because the book brought me lots of ideas. You pointed to the debate. Congratulations, Professor Tobias, and congratulations, Alexandre.
Thanks so much, Diegues, for the comments and pointing out the contributions from the book. And please, Tobias and Alexandre, now we'll give the floor to you again to hear your comments and answers on these questions from Diegues.
Tobias, do you want to start some comments and I can complement later? And how do you need?
Why not? Yes, why not? Yeah. Let me start. So thanks very much for these comments. Very helpful indeed. Let me start with your three contributions you find in the book. I want to re-comment on them. Yeah. So first of all, I think yes, we actually present a lot of Chinese specificities, but on the other hand, the book is written with the intent to de-exoticize China, to let other people, non-China specialists, know that there are indeed many institutions and structures that you would find in other countries too. So in that respect, China is not that sui generis. So I think that's the overall idea. So we want to make China comparable, although yes, there are specificities, but I mean, any country has its specificities, I guess. Yeah. So that's number one. I can also connect to your point on the Weberian bureaucracy. And then I think Alex can join in, and then I can come back later. So the idea, yes, so indeed, what we find is not a textbook Weberian bureaucracy. Yeah, rather, especially in the two case studies, we find a trend of relatively incoherent activities, and I'm now mainly talking about the national central government level, a trend from relative incoherence to relative coherence. Yeah. So, for instance, the initial push for new energy vehicles, so electric vehicles, came from within the Ministry of Science and Technology, and it's then Minister Wang Gang. But interestingly, this guy, Wang Gang, at the very beginning, was based in a small office for electric vehicles at this huge ministry. So it was a very small office which existed for some time. And this guy, Wang Gang, had a policy network around him. Wang Gang himself is a scholar turned official, by the way. And he kind of organized a policy network which recruited supporters, and then over time more and more pitched their ideas to central policymakers. Yeah? When the industry took shape then the MIIT, so the other ministry that Alexandre has introduced, took the lead, but only after the mid-2010s. Yeah. And yes, maybe then it could take advantage of its more technocratic profile. And the NDRC, which some have in the past argued is kind of this super ministry like the MITI in Japan, which in reality it is not, we find. The NDRC in the electric vehicles industry, for instance, had rather a coordinating role. Yeah. So what do you see? What I want to say with this is the opposite of what we would expect in well-organized Weberian bureaucracies. Yeah. So rather, there's a lot of chaos actually at the beginning. It depends sometimes on policy networks and policy entrepreneurs, if you like, these guys like Wang Gang, and it takes years of back and forth intra-ministerial debates and sometimes struggles as well to finally come up with some sort of avenue for relatively coherently developing the industry through these ministries and finally MIIT. So in that sense, you could say it's a good enough bureaucracy. Rather, it's not close to this ideal type. But I would also ask, where do we find that ideal type? Yeah. So this is also something, I guess, that is also helpful to maybe address the lack of bureaucratic coherence in very much developed economies. Yeah. I could talk to you about examples from Germany, but I leave it here.
Thank you, Tobias, and thank you, Diegues, for your comments. Really great to hear from you. So thank you for highlighting, our contributions and your interpretation. And I think all the points you made were quite insightful as well. I tried to just add some other points here. Let me start with this point about, I think the key point here about the bureaucracy is the ideas of adaptability and learning. So the capacity of the Chinese bureaucracy to learn over time and to adapt to new situations. So that means you don't have a clear blueprint, or if you have, it's never static in the long run. It may change your blueprint after a while. So the example that Tobias gave is a great one. The way EVs started in China. It started basically in one ministry from one particular policy network, and then now the leadership is with the MIIT. So there's a lot of dynamics going on. So what we're really trying to argue, I hope you could make it in the conclusion, is that the Chinese bureaucracy is not really ossified, as some people say. It's not like a bunch of static bureaucrats not doing anything, sit down in their offices. No, there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of adaptation. So that's, I think, a core message as well of the book. And you try to illustrate that. And I think many of our comments, Diegues, they play with a kind of tension or contradiction that we try to make it explicit as well in the book. That is, on the one hand, we may have coherence, and that's very important to have bureaucratic coherence. But at the same time, we argue that you need experimentation and adaptability. So how to combine both? Are they complementary or they antithesis? So can you have at the same time coherence and experimentation? I think that's a key question, which I believe is not fully answered by anyone, but that's, I believe, a core debate. I think what we would argue in the case of China, what makes the system particularly functional is that you do have great level of coherence at the central level, but this is combined with regional decentralization. That means local governments have a lot of leeway for experimenting. And then out of this tension between central goals and central control, or central coherence with regional decentralization and experimentation, you have at the same time some chaos, some confusion and incoherence and problems going on, because of course local agents are allowed to deviate from the central plan at some point. But also you create some authors would argue, productive incoherences. So that is, by deviating slightly from the central plan, you may come up with different strategies or different successes. So just to give a very concrete example of electric vehicles, we know that the core goal of the bureaucracy is to promote technological upgrading and innovation and highly competitive national brands, the global frontier. At the same time, we have a very small company, or relatively small company in Liuzhou, creating a low-cost, affordable car, which became the best-selling vehicle in China for 2 years in a row. And they didn't receive subsidies precisely because they're not so sophisticated. So this deviation from let's say, the central level was actually welcomed. I mean, you're not punished for doing that. So it created a different type of goal, right? So that was extremely important in particular to match this particular low cost affordable EV with China's domestic demand, because of course the Chinese GDP, of course, quite large in absolute terms, but as in terms of income per capita is relatively low, like 20% of the US, so to speak. So you need this kind of low cost affordable EVs as well, not only the top notch, the high end type. So out of these contradictions and tensions between central control and central plans and coherence with regional decentralization, you can come up with all these different innovations and adaptabilities and learning. So I think that's a core message also of the book. I think one of the points you mentioned about these different industries, right? So China is trying at the same time to catch up, but also take the leadership in emerging industries. And I think that can only be possible if you allow a decent level of adaptability and decentralization. So you can have different sectors of the bureaucracy, or if you wish, different regions being more competitive in one type of industry, but less competitive in others. So that's what allows China to actually play on both fronts, or walk on two legs, if you wish. So different bureaucracies or different bureaucratic arrangements are important to deal with different industrial strategies, precisely because in some cases you're going to have a sort of institutional lock-in, as you mentioned. So you can easily argue, for instance, that the old industrial policy for automobiles, for the traditional ICE, internal combustion engine vehicles, was facing a type of lock-in, because after investing a lot for a long time, they really couldn't compete on the equal basis of global or Western companies and Japanese companies. So they managed to do a kind of leapfrog strategy. So the bureaucratic requirements for that was one of that you don't have only a static blueprint, but you manage to do something in between the lines or in parallel. So this adaptability is very important. And as Tobias mentioned, you have to allow other players, like in the case of Wangan, in the case of most, to come up with new ideas and to pitch these ideas to other policymakers and central level ministries. At the same time, certain industries, particularly the catching up industries, they might benefit a lot from a typical centralized strategy. And here, I think what we need is a sort of a selective centralization. That's possibly what happened in the case of, for instance, high-speed rail. When China managed to catch up with Japan, and China became a leader in high-speed rail with a very centralized system. So actually very few experimentation, at least in comparison with other industries. The same could be argued nowadays with shipbuilding industry. The shipbuilding, again, very capital intensive, just like railways and just like semiconductors, so very capital intensive. And then you really need to centralize resources into very few big businesses and try to catch up. And you can do that because you may have a kind of blueprint, as we're talking about mature catching up industry. So then China has to walk on two legs. So try to have bureaucratic arrangements that caters for the sort of emerging industries, but at the same time, sectors of the bureaucracy that are able to cater for this particular type of catching up industry. And in relation to King Ling, I think one core idea here would be the windows of opportunity, right? So there are a lot of windows of opportunity, in particular in relation to the green transition. And China is being quite active in trying to take advantage of those windows of opportunity. So there is of course, they try to align, say, green or environmental goals with the traditional catching up innovation, technological supremacy goals. So again, try to have different institutional arrangements in order to adapt and learn based on different industries and different goals. I think that's it. Yeah. So if there's anything else, please let me know. Maybe I forgot some points.
Great, Alexandre. Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you, Tobias. Before I give also the floor to Professor Célio Hiratuka, who is here also, will comment a bit. I would like to make a comment because I thought very interesting to in the book and the presentation as well, to this, because you bring this interconnection between macro and micro through the institutionality and the political economy perspective. I think that's a great contribution also to the development literature. not only to specialists, as you pointed out, also to the general audience, to see how in practice the implementation also face some challenge, the post-implementation, right? So I think this is a great contribution also, the book analyzing the Chinese case. I would just leave two small questions, then I'll give the floor to Professor Célio, and you can answer, I think, together. There's two questions. One would be about the importance of state-owned enterprise. If you see any differences in the treatment of state-owned enterprises as a vehicle for indigenous innovation in China, or the incentives in general go similar to state-owned enterprises and private companies, even local level. We know that many of them are SOEs, even the role of SASAC into this part. So if you can comment a bit on that. And more recent, as you point, Alexandre, about the energy transition, these new, a bit new word concern, global concern. Also, China has been playing a key part and changing its position into this energy transition over this time, from the 90s to nowadays, given also its economic importance or re-emergence, right, in the global scenario. So how do you see a bit these international or global inputs into the Chinese bureaucracy, meaning how these affect the way China see its role and its strategy of development, and even the policy implementation? Is there any perception of these, or it's a more internal process? How do you see these in the research? So thank you very much. And now, Professor Célio, thank you very much also to be here with us.
Thank you, Roberto. I'd like to thank you, Alexandre and Tobias again. I had the opportunity to saw the announcement of the book in the last SASI meeting. And I just confirmed now that it was a terrific book, a lot of contribution. I'd like to make two very short questions. First one, I'd like to hear a little more about the difference between the electric vehicle sector and the semiconductor sector, especially in the matter of what you call the vertical coherence in the book. You drew attention to the difference between a more mature sector and the sector that is in the early stages of the innovation cycle, and how this difference changed the balance between experimentation and economies of scale, to summarize. But over time, how do you see the dynamics of changing of this balance? Because it's possible to see that sometimes, especially maybe in the electric vehicle sector, that heterogeneity between companies probably is decreasing through a process of merger and acquisition, or even with the process of concentration in the market. So increasing economies of scale, maybe probably it's happening in the semiconductor sector also. How do you see this issue, the dynamic change of this balance between experimentation and economies of scale, the changes in the structure of the market structure, and also the necessity to change the mix of policy and so on. And the second one is the issue of local finance of innovative activities. How have local governments financed these activities? How important was the real estate expansion for these local resources, especially because with the real estate market crisis, has the central government adopted any measure to compensate for the reduction in the local government resource? How important is this crisis in the real estate sector for not only for the local fiscal resource, but specifically for the supporting of innovative activities?
So Tobias or Alexandre, please.
Okay.
Sure.
Do you want me to start, Alex, or do you want to start?
Yeah, you can start. I can complement later, as I did before.
Let me pick I mean, if I understood, Roberto, if I understood your second question right, this was about learning from experiences from other countries when it comes to the sectors we have dealt with, and maybe others. You mentioned, I think, this green energy transition and stuff like that. And yes, there's a lot of that. In particular, I think we also mentioned that in the book, that there has been like learning trips by Chinese officials to California, for instance, where they had also played around and experimented with some policies to increase the role of new energy vehicles. So in that sense, yes, there's a lot of learning, but there's also always the idea of how can we translate these ideas from abroad into our specific and maybe unique context. Yeah? So there's not just emulation, but there is learning as well in the sense of translating and then transforming ideas as well from abroad. I think this is also something that is relevant. And then last not least, Célio, with regard to your last question, yes, I think the real estate crisis presents problems for local governments. But here, I think it also depends a bit on where we stand. Yeah, I think this crisis probably is much more problematic for, I don't know, third-tier cities in the Dongbei northeast region, for instance, than in Guangzhou, Shanghai, Suzhou. Yeah, I think they can relatively well cope with these crises. I'm not saying this is nothing. Yeah, but I think in comparison, some richer cities, first-tier cities, I think would probably be in a better position to deal with these effects. So if you go, for instance, so I just went to Shanghai some weeks ago. Here, the prices have really gone down quite dramatically in the last year. But if you go further north, they have gone down more. Yeah, so there's actually a stronger effect in, I would say, second or third tier cities towards the northeast region. And that also brings me back one last point to something that Antonio, I think, mentioned, is, so I think you had this question about whether China could maybe manage to do two things at the same time, fostering high-tech manufacturing in the coastal areas, if you want, and then continuing the role of being the kind of low-wage factor to the west in terms of geography, and also to the north. And here I also see issues. Yeah, so I think the momentum these days is really about these high-tech industries. There's also, and at the same time, I think that this leads to a strong inequality in terms, and maybe rising inequality and unevenness in terms of what certain coastal provinces can achieve versus, Dongbei region, so the northeast region, the Rust Belt region, if you want. They had very strong hopes 20 years ago about being the next Guangzhou and the next Guangdong and so on and so forth. Well, it doesn't look that nice, I would say. Yeah, and the same probably goes for several Western provinces. Yeah, so therefore it's this trend. This might be a downside, if you want, of this high tech development and lots of focusing on these issues in the coastal, mainly in the coastal areas, I would say. And one downside might be that there is a lack of support, let's say, for the not so well off regions.
So I think Alexandre may comment that.
Okay, thank you, Roberto, and thank you, Célio, for your comments and questions. I think they touch very important issues here. Let me start with the issue about state-owned enterprises and SOEs that Roberto mentioned. Of course, SOEs plays very different roles in the Chinese economy. But I think in relation to your question, let me highlight two different roles. One that they can be quite important, in particular in those catching up industries, mature industries. So again, we're talking about big business industry where you need concentration of capital and very capital intensive sectors. So again, think in terms of the shipbuilding industry or high-speed rail. So here, SOEs are particularly well posed to do so. Because recall that private companies in China, as I remember, you put this data in the book as well, chapter 2.2, they're relatively small actually on average. So the big companies in China are actually SOEs. So SOEs are actually better posed in order to invest in infrastructure, for instance, and those really large sectors which demand large amounts of capital. So this is one particular importance of SOEs. The second, precisely because they are state-owned, they can be used as instruments in order to steer this new pattern of development. So again, let's talk about electric vehicles again. So it's true that nowadays everyone talks about BYD, which is of course the leading domestic company in China and private owned. But if you come back to the early days of the industry, where of course BYD was very small, I mean the whole industry was very small by definition. So how to create a new industry and how to create new players? I mean, how to convince companies or private companies to suddenly stop producing or reduce the production of internal combustion cars and move towards electrification. And here the big SOEs in the sector were very important, both the Beijing-based BAIC and the Shanghai-based SAIC. So they might not be leaders anymore, but they're very instrumental in starting this move towards electrification. So all of them start to produce electric cars. And that helps to create the new market, to set the new market, which eventually other private companies like BYD or now Xpeng and NIO, etc., may take over in the future. So SOEs played this very important role of helping to implement a new policy that otherwise private companies would not be willing to do so, precisely because in this case, there was no industry to start with like 10, 15 years ago. So this is one issue. Regarding Célio's question about EVs and semiconductors, I think a key point here is the electric vehicles industry is still somehow in the making, but it's getting more consistent now. And that means sooner or later, there must be some rounds of mergers and acquisitions. And by following the news, you see some news that there'll be some mergers here and there. Probably there'll be to be more, especially as the market becomes more mature, precisely in order to benefit from economies of scale. At the moment, the market is still quite fragmented. And what you're trying to argue is that as you're still trying to make the market to create a new industry, this fragmentation overall is more beneficial because you need to test new blueprints, new business models, new strategies, new technologies. But once the market matures, and probably it will happen sooner or later, then you have to move to a more concentrated industry. And if China doesn't do so, they risk to follow the same predicament of the previous internal combustion industry. That is, one of the problems of that industry was precisely the very high number of companies in China, which fragmented the market, and therefore each company couldn't benefit that much from economies of scale. So eventually that will have to happen. So who probably will be against that? Possibly many local governments who depend on those industries for local revenues, budgetary revenues, and employment. So again, central-local relations and how the central government will manage to convince or not local governments to go along with their policy. And always bring in mind, as Tobias mentioned in a different topic, there's a lot of unevenness in China. So some local governments probably be fine with that. May have no problem, but others might be in trouble if they have to shut down some companies or some factories. So again, it's a very uneven country. So you cannot talk about simply as local governments as one entity. You rather have different local governments with different economic structures and therefore different interests. I think that's it. In relation to local finance, I think the only point I would add is, I wrote that in the book as well, sometimes even some research institutes or research-related companies that are actually primarily driven by innovation activities, they also invest in real estate. So then it gets a bit even more messy. So they are innovating, but they are also doing speculation for real estate. That makes the scenario even more complicated in those cases. So that's the final point. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you very much, Alexandre and Tobias. And I think if we haven't any other question, Diegues or Célio, if you want pose any other questions, then we would like to thank you very much, Tobias and Alexandre, for launching the book and for sharing this discussion with us today. So it was a great pleasure, and hopefully you can, both of you, visit us here at University of Campinas soon in person, right? For an event as well. So I'd like to thank you very much, and it was a great pleasure to discuss with us today.
Thanks.